ask you please to make your way out of the building and rendezvous at the front of the building through the fire exits, which are two at the top of the lecture theatre and two at the bottom here. Right, just a couple of other wee things to mention. You may have seen that we've got our programmes printed and they're just down at the front here. So if you want to take a copy with you, if you could do that after the lecture, and some bookmarks as well. Also paid up members who are full members and are entitled to get their copy of the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, which is just being published, thanks to Cormac here. There are copies down here at the front. So again, after the lecture, if you just make sure that your name gets ticked off, and you can take those away with you this evening. Right, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with Mike King. Mike originally hailed from Kent, I believe, and is well known to a lot of us since he's made his home in Northern Ireland. He studied early medieval history at Cambridge and early medieval archaeology in Durham University, gaining MAs at both before continuing to do yet another MA at Leicester University in museum studies, which provided the foundation of his career as a museum curator. From 1989 to 1994, he was curator in Perth Museum in Scotland, and he no doubt gained his love of all things Pictish during his time there. Followed that up with from 1994 to 2000 as curator of St Andrews Museum, and then came over to Northern Ireland, and from 2000 to 2022 was curator of Down Museum, and very much instrumental in the refurbishment of the Governor's residence and the extension to house the Downpatrick High Cross. Since his so-called retirement, he's now working as a tour director with the prestigious ACE Cultural Tours Company, but he still maintains his interests local to Northern Ireland. So he's also well published, and not least in the Ulster Journal. I think it was the 2023 volume, I think, that he did a paper on the Downpatrick High Cross. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike. So thanks very much for coming to. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much. I hope you can see that quite clearly. It's a great big screen, isn't it? I think I last spoke here actually, probably could be 15 years ago actually. It was about the High Cross. And so I thought to make a return visit. I hope you can all hear me now. Thank you very much to the Society for inviting me to speak this evening. It's a subject I started thinking about when I worked in museums in Scotland in the 1990s. But here in Northern Ireland, I got distracted a little by high crosses, and also Brian Sloan digging 3-metre deep middens in the tennis courts beside Down Cathedral, which was great fun. They weren't playing tennis at the time, of course. But I've only just recently returned to this subject. And of course, there are some Irish connections, which you'll be glad to know. It's very important. But I'm going to also connect the Picts to Europe and the Mediterranean. And that's why I have this quote here from Leslie Alcock about the Picts being a typical Northwest European barbarian society. And they're often thought of as rather different or alien because they're outside the Roman Empire. But the more we look at the history and the archaeology, it seems they're very much connected with Britain, Ireland, and the continent. I just wanted to put this one up because I have the inspiration of the great and much missed Eamon O'Carrigoyne and Peter Harbison to thank for the direction I'm going to be taking you in this evening, though I sadly never had a chance to discuss this paper with them. So what are the Pictish symbols? As well as appearing on small artifacts of silver, bronze, stone, cannel coal, and bone, they constitute a group of between 30 and 50 symbols, incised or carved in relief on stone monuments that may be found in modern-day Scotland, from the Scottish borders in the south to the Shetland Islands in the north, and from Aberdeenshire in the east to Skye in the west. And you can see the distribution of them on this map. You can see there's rather distinct eastern and northern distribution in Scotland. The Borthwick pillar from west of Howick with a vertical salmon has been added to this map. And like the Edinburgh symbol stone, it takes the distribution south of the Forth estuary. 5 symbols are found more frequently than others, seen here at the top on the left: the crescent and V-rod, double disc and Z-rod, the mirror and comb, and the so-called swimming Pictish beast. You can see an array of them on the left-hand side there. We have to bear in mind 2 factors: that the meaning of the symbols probably has to encompass both artifacts used by the living and memorials to the dead, and also that their use disregarded internal political boundaries. Since 1903, when Joseph Anderson and J. Romilly Allen documented the Pictish monuments then known, stones with symbols have been divided into 2 groups. Class 1 stones, being rough boulders or standing stones, are incised with symbols but no cross. You can see it there in the center. While Class 2 are dressed stones carved with symbols, the Christian cross, and often a variety of other ornaments and creatures. You can see one on the right there. Anderson and Allen felt that the occurrence of the symbols with the cross was significant, and named their work the Early Christian Monuments of Scotland. The prevailing view today is that Class 1 monuments predate the arrival of Christianity, which we might date roughly to the period in which St. Columba of Iona was active in Pictland, between 563 and 597, according to his biographer, Adamnan, writing at the end of the 7th century. Radiocarbon dating in recent years has provided some useful dates for symbol-bearing bone artifacts, particularly examples from Orkney, which placed them in the range of the 5th to the early 7th centuries. And you can see some on the left there. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to radiocarbon date stones themselves. Radiocarbon dates centering on the late 3rd and 4th centuries from beneath a wall on the promontory fort of Dannecair, near Dunnottar, on the Aberdeenshire coast, from which a group of 5 symbol stones are said to have been pushed off a wall into the sea below in 1832, have been provided with a caveat by the excavator Gordon Noble, that the samples cannot date the carving of the stones, but they do provide a terminus post quem if the stones came from that location. One stone has decoration on both sides and has been cut down, suggesting at least one phase of reuse. And this could have happened if the stones were brought in to repair a wall at a later date. The combination of a fish and triangle on another stone from Dannecair at the base there on the right is also seen in the Book of Kells, dating to about 800 CE. There are no examples of Pictish symbol stones being placed originally in a wall elsewhere, though many ended up being reused in later churches and other buildings. A significant strand of scholarship, exemplified by Francis Diack, Charles Thomas, and Stephen Driscoll, has interpreted the Class 1 stones as memorials to the dead, seeing them as cognate with the inscribed stones bearing names of elite individuals dating to the 5th and 6th centuries that may be found in southern Scotland and also West Wales and Cornwall. Significantly, it's very rare to find a burial directly associated with inscribed stones, as it is to find one associated with a symbol stone. Though once located in cemeteries, this applies to the early Capstane near Kirkliston on the left, but also to the now displaced Class 1 Newton stone in Aberdeenshire, bearing inscriptions in cursive Roman and Ogham scripts, as well as a mirror symbol, and to the 8th century inscribed stone found in several pieces at Port Mahomet in the Tarbert Peninsula. Inscriptions themselves are rare on Pictish symbol stones, generally being inscribed in ogam, and this rarity of inscription significantly also applies to the large corpus of carved stones surviving at the monastery of Iona, from where Columba set out on his expeditions to Pictland. If the Pictish monuments are memorials, then the paucity of inscribed names may be influenced by Iona's preference for the long-term anonymity of the deceased, which in fact became the norm in Britain and Ireland by the end of the 7th century. The symbols appear to be fixed in their basic recognizable forms from the beginning of their use. Rosemary Cramp was of the opinion that the symbols were designed at one time by one group of artists, and that they had an unambiguous message to relate. Charles Thomas believed that the animal symbols were totems. Other symbols represented Iron Age objects symbolizing status and professions, and the Z and V rods were broken spears and arrows, symbolizing death. All might have been drawn from the tattoo designs that classical writers associated with the Picti, the painted ones, to create symbol statements about individuals. Anthony Jackson saw the symbol pairs on many Class 1 stones as representing marriage alliances between elite families, but the distribution pattern of symbol pairs and groups does not show any territorial consistency, which might underpin his arguments. The mirror and comb combination has often been seen as a feminine determinative, signifying a female grave or the involvement of a woman in a burial, but many scholars have questioned this assumption. The most popular current interpretation is that the symbols represent the names of the deceased, or labels for figures carved on the stones, adding a third writing system to the more rare Ogham and Roman-based alphabets used for inscription on Pictish monuments. But taking the example of Egyptian hieroglyphs, we might be looking for phonograms, in which a symbol can represent one letter, 2 letters, biliterals, or 3 letters, triliterals, or an ideogram, in which a symbol represents a real thing or a concept. Interestingly, words spelt phonetically could be reduced to the first initial letter, such as seneb, the last word in the phrase Ankh Wejar Seneb, meaning life, prosperity, and health, often found on inscriptions, even as late as the Rosetta Stone. Here, seneb is reduced to its initial letter S, a concept represented by a simple symbol through frequent usage. Sampson has proposed that the symbols represented syllables, creating dithematic names. They're often found in pairs on stones, as you can see there on the right. While Cummins suggested that particular symbols represented complete names, such as those of known Pictish kings. Forsyth concluded that there were not enough symbols to represent letters or syllables, but they might represent a limited range of appropriate phrases identifying a person, such as here lies A, this belongs to A, this was erected by A, or pray for A. Lee's statistical analysis of the Pictish symbol system concluded that they do represent a writing system, but Sproat's scathing critique of the methodology used by his team has severely undermined their conclusions. In fact, no symbol or group of symbols has yet been shown to represent a word or name. Sproat's own work on non-linguistic symbol systems is more useful here, as it provides examples of systems of ideograms that have been used in different contexts. One example is the notation system of about 20 to 30 symbols used to signify the content and actions of 62 prayers invented by Silas John Edwards, a Western Apache shaman, in 1904, and published by Basso and Anderson in 1973. This was not a true writing system, but rather a system of pictorial prompts, and the symbols and prayers had to be learnt under instruction. I will be arguing that the so-called Z rod and V rod that overlie certain symbols represent initial letters of significant words, and this appears to be supported by the rather compressed Z that is incised on the Moni Musk cross slab, which has internal leaf decoration and pelter-like terminals, which imitate initials found in late antique manuscripts found on the continent, from the late 5th and 6th century mainly. This would not be surprising, as with the cross came books and literacy. The question I wish to test is, can the Pictish symbols relate to symbols of salvation we are familiar with in early Christianity? do the symbols on the class 2 stones make any sense when they're associated with the Christian cross? I'm going to make the case that the Pictish symbols are recognizable Christian ideograms of late antique and native Pictish inspiration, and that combinations of symbols on stones can effectively be amplified to read as pictorial invocations, asking for intercession for the souls of the deceased, permanently inscribed in stone for eternal reiteration. Rather than being part of a rigid system in which certain symbols are excluded for subjective reasons and some are stated to be abstract, I see them as a constellation of intelligible and interchangeable ideograms, all representing different aspects of the same message of salvation. As essentially symbols of life, they could also be displayed by the living on belongings, talismans, and regalia as apotropaic signs of faith and for divine protection. Such a widespread art required an extraordinary wave of motivation, such as one inspired by a revolution in the way people perceived life and death. Some symbols appear to imitate pictorially the concepts on the southern inscribed stones. Others take the form of Latin and Greek initial letters. Some indicate knowledge of heroic secular and biblical tales of men who faced death but did not die. And some draw on early Christian symbols known from Irish and continental sources, or everyday objects used in a religious context. Some symbols highlight the special natures of native creatures, and many are often combined or superimposed to express the hope in life after death and burial. I'm proposing here various groups of symbols with a similar meaning, and arrange them in the order in which ideally Christians expected to experience them in life and death as part of the journey towards salvation: baptism, the Eucharist, rest in the grave, resurrection, and the attainment of heaven. Late antique Christianity was a religion of many images, each with its own angle on salvation, and many deriving from texts. Stone slabs bearing incised crosses are found mainly on monastic sites in Scotland, whereas much scholarship has suggested that the symbol stones extend into the realm of the Pictish secular elite, and I see them as expressing their specific hopes of salvation and eternal life beyond their death, for them their dies natalis, or day of birth. Before I explore the different groups of related symbols outlined here, I'd like to provide a brief background to the imagery of the late antique Christian world, its ornamental vocabulary and symbolic syntax, which will appear in my interpretations. Early Christian and late antique Christian funerary imagery, as found in the catacombs and on the sarcophagi of Rome, focuses mainly on abridged symbols of resurrection, and it is characterized by progressive abbreviation. Only one or two salient or telltale features remained as clues to identify the subject. The most popular images of hope related to Jonah's swallowing by the sea monster and rest under the gourd outside Nineveh after his regurgitation. Noah in his arca, depicted as a large box, and Daniel in his den with the lions, and Habakkuk's food drop, facilitated by an angel to keep him alive. This imagery of hope and resurrection sufficed Christians for several centuries before the cross, early on seen as a symbol of humiliation and death, first became significant in the 5th century. It was also in the 5th century that the motif of the pelter-shaped fountain of life took root in Christian art and architecture. Chapter 2 of the book of Genesis describes a spring or fonds that rose out of the earth to water paradise. This fountain of life is a central element in the late antique iconography of baptism and the washing away of sin and impurities, which entered early prayers for the dead. Here you can see it flowing out in all directions from lozenge designs in the Ravenna baptistry of Bishop Naon, and on a very similar incised symbol on a stone at Kintore in Aberdeenshire. The Pelter fountain can also be seen in the mosaics in the early 6th century baptistry at Butrint on the left. That's in Albania, where it is enclosed by crescent forms. Parallels may be seen in the revival of the Celtic Pelter in the Cark of Columba and on the Clonmore Shrine, representing the type of models that were very likely transmitted to the Picts with Christianity. Mark Handley has argued for continuity between the Christian Latin inscriptions of Roman Britain and those of the 5th and 6th centuries in Western and Northern Britain. Certain phrases such as hic jacet, here lies, recur on these Christian memorials to elite individuals in different combinations, pointing to the burial places of baptized Christians, sometimes resting in a tumulus, a burial mound, and awaiting their resurrection. We can also see continuity in the use of certain Christian symbols, for example, the Chi Rho symbol and the Kirkmadrine stones, incorporating the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name. But this time they had become an ideogram, the encircling wreath of victory, signifying eternal life, so modifying the cross, a symbol of death, to indicate hope for new life. While we can identify sea monsters in early Irish manuscripts bearing a cross to identify them as under the control of God, imitating Mediterranean examples, we can also see this reflected in Pictish art, where a sea monster carries a mirror symbol here on the right, and we will see why perhaps later. The vocabulary of eternal life can be found, for example, in the form of the ivy leaf, seen on mosaic floors of baptistries and on the gold Gordon pattern from Merovingian Gaul, but also as a terminal for cross arms at the 6th century church of Cahallahillan in Kerry, and for a Z-rod terminal on a symbol stone at Rhynie in Aberdeenshire. Gordon Noble's new publication of his excavations at Rhynie reminds us that pottery was arriving in Rhynie from the eastern Mediterranean in the late 5th and early 6th century, no doubt accompanied by objects of Christian origin. So looking at these semantic groups of symbols, among the symbols are a number of items that look like everyday Pictish utensils. For example, a hammer, anvil, tongs, a cauldron, and a mirror. Representing the tools of a smith, the hammer, anvil, and tongs evoke the processes of creation and transformation that can be associated with the divine being. They're seen on Roman pottery of the north of England, associated with a smith god, and may still have resonated with magical powers in early medieval Britain and Ireland, though churchmen worked towards having these subsumed by the Christian creator god. The tools of the smith could also have been recruited visually as the means by which God would transform the dead and refashion them at the resurrection. This may be the sense in which they are used on the Abernethy symbol stone and the Dunfermline cross slab, representing a prayer to Christ to remake and give new life to the deceased. On the symbol-bearing cross slab located next to the old manse in Glamis, Angus, under the left arm of a large cross, two men are depicted having been thrown headfirst into a cauldron, while below two warriors fight with axes. This sequence reflects an incident in the second branch of the Mabinogi, in which Irish warriors who are killed while fighting Britons in Ireland are thrown into the Per Dedani, or the cauldron of resurrection, and then re-emerge ready to fight again, but unable to speak. A scene depicting the revivification of pagan warriors drawn from a traditional narrative would have provided a poignant contrast to the life-giving resurrection offered by Christ. On Glamis 1, the cauldron symbol to the right of the cross shaft can be seen as the antithesis of the pagan cauldron, likely representing an everyday two-handled vessel put to use as a portable font for the consecrated water required for baptism. To the patron of the cross slab, baptism would have represented the only true path to resurrection and the peace of eternal life, contrary to the pagan story of the senseless recycling of men unable to praise God, to pursue endless warfare. Niamh Whitfield has made a strong case for the use of wells as places of baptism during the conversion period, and everyday vessels like cauldrons could have been used to draw water for consecration prior to sprinkling over the candidates for baptism. A symbol stone which partially covered the well at Tobanamore on Skye until 1910 may allude to baptism through its cauldron symbol. The well could be the location where the Lord of Dún Osdale in the background was baptized. as Art was baptized by St. Columba on the point of death on Skye and later buried under a cairn. Turning to mirrors, no Pictish period mirrors have yet been found archaeologically. The kind of high-status silver mirror still in use during this period was generally a circular, horizontal handled type, designed to be held by a servant, as shown here on the right, on the Proiector casket from Rome. A magnificent late Roman example was found at Wroxeter, and Byzantine examples have been dated from the 5th to the 7th centuries. Carola Hicks noted how some Pictish mirrors resembled Roman-handled pans. Could the symbol actually represent a reused Roman pan rather than a mirror? Craig Sesford also compared the handles of 8th century mirror symbols to those of early medieval copper alloy ladles. One example found at Charlfleet on the Isle of Wight has a cross on its handle and has been interpreted as a baptismal ladle of the 7th century for affusion, the pouring of water over the head. A group of these comes from 7th century Anglo-Saxon contexts, including burials, while 8th to 9th century examples with a round terminal to the handle come from Castle Derg and the River Suir in Ireland. In plan view, they resemble mirror symbols like that on the Formston cross slab in the centre. This type of everyday ladle may well have been turned to use in the baptismal ritual. This type of ladle appears on later insular sculpture, such as Irish high crosses, Anglo-Saxon crosses at Durham, and on the shaft of a cross slab from Ballyheeney on the Isle of Man, often with the bowl scooped out. On the symbol stones, both the cauldron and the ladle can be seen as containers of life-giving water. If Picts saw their reflection in the real model of the so-called mirror symbol, perhaps it was in water, not silver or bronze. The baptismal ladle for affusion is an appropriate match for its frequent partner, the everyday single-sided or double-sided comb. Well documented as a utensil for cleansing. Finds of combs associated with baptistries at Marine and Salona in modern Croatia suggest their use for purification, exorcism, or anointing as part of baptismal rituals. According to a late life by Concubranus, the wooden comb of Saint Mornina, a younger contemporary of St. Patrick, was long preserved as a relic at Killeavy in South Armagh. She's said to have used it to comb her hair once a year on the Thursday before Easter, a day associated with purification and exorcism prior to baptism. As indicators of baptism, the ladle and comb on symbol-bearing stones would make sense as marking the burial places of baptized Christians, especially as they are often found below other symbols near the earth, where the baptized, combed and anointed head of the deceased supposedly lay. And you can see on this stone from Tote on the right there how the mirror and comb are at the base of the stone. Stags can be seen on the symbol stone from Grantown and the cross slab at Easy in Scotland. On the reverse of the Skye cross slab from Fife, a hunting scene appears beneath a Pictish beast. Physiologus describes the stag as a faithful man, and hunting scenes involving a stag are frequently linked to the first verse of Psalm 42. As a heart desires the water brooks, so my soul longs for you, O God. A remarkable detail confirms this imagery on the Skye stone, as the muzzle of the stag overlaps the vertical Ogham inscription of the name Edonon, probably St. Ethanan, who died in 667, according to the Annals of Ulster, and was associated with the monasteries on the Isle of May and at Kilrenny along the coast of Fife. The Ogham stem of Ethanan's name appears to represent the salvific stream in the psalm, and the stag is drinking from it. The saint is equated with the stream or fountain of life. The imagery of the stone therefore appears to display sophisticated prayer for intercession from the saint on behalf of the deceased in the grave below. In 2002, Thomas Clancy noted that churchmen in Scotland during this period were thinking about and had developed a deep devotion to the Eucharist. And this is demonstrated by the exaltation of the host on a stand, having been delivered by a raven, conveniently, between the hermits Paul and Anthony on the pediment of the 8th century Nig cross slab in Easter Ross. The dual perspective of the Nig image offers an explanation of the so-called mirror case symbol below, as the exalted Eucharistic host shown in plan on a pattern, sometimes exhibiting a cross design, but always on a vertical stand shown in profile. The significance of the Eucharistic host on a funerary or commemorative monument is the necessary provision of the host to the Christian in order to reach paradise. The penitential of Vinian, dating to about the mid-6th century, makes it clear that the viaticum, the administering of the host at the point of death, was customary at that time, and it was never to be denied by clerics. One Pictish symbol on the 8th century Ulster cross slab, in Caithness, appears to represent a round loaf with 4 wings attached to it, in the same configuration as Pictish angels, but horizontally aligned. The cross appears like a beacon suspended in the sky, with Pictish symbols all around it. And the manna of Exodus chapter 16 is falling down from the heavens to nourish the faithful. No expense spared here. Yeah. Moving on to Noah, Isidore of Seville was just one of many scholars who repeated the early Christian belief that the name Noah meant rest or requies, as he awaited the ebbing away of the flood waters in his arca. And this reminds us how 5th and 6th century inscriptions describe the dead as resting in the grave. Mark Handley has emphasized the wide variety of phrases inscribed on late antique memorial monuments across Europe and North Africa, describing how Christians lie at rest in a tomb or a tumulus, and has noted how a significant 6th century group in Salona, Croatia, refers to the deceased as being contained in an arca, potentially referencing both Noah at rest and a physical wooden coffin. The Pictish rectangle symbol follows both textual and visual traditions of the arca as a box with a window or doors, and sometimes waves around it, as can be seen on late antique Roman sarcophagi, also in the Ashburnham Pentateuch of about 600 CE on the left, where men and giants are floating in the flood, and also on a symbol stone found at Dice in Aberdeenshire, I believe. You can see how the Dice stone has a font, a ladle, a comb, and arca, all emphasizing the ritual of baptism, if this interpretation holds. The box shape of the arca is also treated as a framed canvas in some cases, as on the Golspie stone in Sutherland, where at the top it frames a depiction of the arca as a vessel with prows, with the fountains of the deep and the firmament opening up to cause the flood through the combination of the waters from the abyss below and the celestial waters from above the firmament. Here, between the circles of the sun and moon, witnessing a cosmic event, we see an inverted pelter representing the deluge falling on Noah's boat. And here I think you can see one of the sea monsters pushing down this evil man who's created this need for God to cause the flood. And he's kicking all the symbols of salvation, but he's also drowning, like one of the giants in the Ashburnham Pentateuch. Among all the Christian subjects seen in late Roman art, the narrative of Jonah's baptism in the sea and his swallowing and regurgitation by a sea monster was the most popular. The story of Jonah took on particular significance as a result of Christ's words in the Gospel of St. Matthew. As Jonah was in the whale's belly 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah's ordeal was therefore seen as a clear prefiguration of the resurrection of Christ. The Hebrew dag or Latin ketus of the Old Testament story could actually be depicted as any kind of imaginary sea monster. Every age and region has depicted Jonah's sea monster differently, and the Picts were no different in creating different depictions of it. I'd argue that the idea of the deceased being still inside the sea monster, awaiting resurrection, is paramount in Pictish art, and then this is what the so-called Pictish beast represents. The beast itself appears to derive from the type of sea monster found in the Roman Virgil, probably a product of northern Gaul or even Britain in the late 5th century, in particular the creatures depicted in the Storm at Sea miniature on the left. While Jonah is actually depicted inside the sea monster in the 9th century Cludov Psalter, bottom right, this view inside the creature is rare. We should rather follow Victoria Whitworth in her assessment of the now damaged, long, slithering sea monster on the side of Meagle recumbent number 12 at the bottom there, in seeing it as symbolically mapping out or containing the body of the deceased under the monument. An invisible person has been swollen by death, but has the potential to be regurgitated and brought back to life. Both the Arca of Noah, in which he rested, and the Ketus, which swallowed Jonah, may be seen as a container of the soul after death by a process of conceptual metonymy. This is a cognitive process in which one conceptual entity provides mental access to another. A subset allows a container to stand for its contents, much like number 10 is used to refer to the Prime Minister, whom it houses inside. Or a drinking glass means that I'm drinking water in a glass, not the glass itself. Being a people familiar with the sea, including its many perils, the Picts enthusiastically embraced maritime symbols as vessels of salvation. Both the Arca and the Pictish sea monsters may therefore refer to a baptized Christian lying at rest inside their tomb, awaiting resurrection. Although such symbols gained their meaning from their connection to biblical figures, no figures were included, as the symbols were highly simplified and applied specifically to the salvation of the deceased. They were not biblical narrative cycles, but abbreviated symbols referring to men who did not die. They were saved by God. The references of the symbols were clear to Christians who set them up, from the Boulders to the Shetlands. It's my contention that prayers were said for the dead at grave sites in the form of petitions to God, as found in the Commendatio Animae, which referred to the saving of Old Testament figures and the hope that the deceased would be saved in like manner. These petitions are preserved in a developed form in the 8th century Gelon Sacramentary, but individual petitions can be identified on artifacts dating back to the 4th century, such as the Doclea cup on the left, found in a late Roman tomb in Albania in 1870. The phraseology of salvation using the verb liberare was applied to the saving of Noah, Daniel, and Jonah, among others, in the expectation that the deceased would be saved just as they were saved. Whereas these prayers were said for the dying, the symbol stones represent their permanent incision in pictorial form for the benefit of the deceased in their tombs. A so-called triple vesica symbol found beneath a cross on the Skinnet stone in Caithness, on the right there, appears in a similar form on a small cross base in the baptistry at Poitiers. It appears to have a specific meaning and may refer to the 3 days spent by Christ in the tomb, referring symbolically to the time spent by the dead awaiting the resurrection. We can also grasp the meaning of the crescent and V-rod from the Skinnet stone, a Byzantine silver reliquary casket in Toronto, shows us the cross standing on a knoll where the fountain of life springs up, just as the Skinnet cross stands above the crescent containing a fountain motif. If we dissect the crescent and V-rod symbol, we can see how the lower curve of the symbol can represent a burial mound. The V formed of budding branches has its intersection below the mound and springs from where the dead lie buried, representing, I believe, the initial letter of V, of vita, that is life. Over the mound, a fountain and lateral springs emerge to create a crescent shape and symbolize the washing of the soul in preparation for eternal life. On the Klein Kirkton symbol stone, we can see how the image builds up and how a rectangle below the crescent can represent the arca carrying the deceased in the grave, lying at rest like Noah. That can also symbolize a wooden coffin. Another letter appears to overlie three Pictish symbols, that is the Greek Z or zeta-shaped rod, which is sometimes reversed in inscriptions. Depicted on late antique garments of saints and prophets as so-called gammadia symbols on mosaics, and in stucco in the 5th century baptistry of Bishop Neon in Ravenna. The zeta signifies Zoe, life, that is eternal life. This is the meaning of the great golden mosaic Z placed centrally on the robes of Christ as he sits in majesty on the globe of the universe, on the apse mosaic in the church of St. Vitale in Ravenna, dating to about 547. It can also be found in an initial in the Gospel of St. John, in the Lindisfarne Gospels. You can see it looks very odd there because that's the initial IN, but it's got a huge Z in the middle, which is very distinctive, must have a purpose. And this initial initiates a description of Christ as the life that was the light of mankind. So it would be logical to think that that also represents the word Zoe. Both Joseph Anderson and Robert Stevenson referred to the main elements of the Z and V rod symbols as floriated rods. And rather than suggesting spears, arrows, or death, they're often curved and sinuous forms, flower-like terminals, and sprouting shoots evoke new growth and life. Simple incised crosses themselves may sometimes be shown with similar tendrils of new growth, as on this example on the slate in the top right-hand corner found at Jarlshof in Shetland. And you can see how the this thing that is said to be a broken spear doesn't look like anything like a spear that this fellow is holding. And certainly this doesn't look like a spear. It's rather wilted. And it's got things growing out of it. Isabel Henderson proposed that picture sculptors were familiar with certain allegorical interpretations of creatures such as the snake found in the text known as Physiologus, the Latin version of which originated in the 4th century and was known to St. Ambrose. This text describes how at a great age the snake squeezes out through a hole between rocks, shedding its old skin, and symbolically casting off its mortality. And we get that phrase, losing our, what is mortal coil, I forget what you're saying. Casting off our mortal coil, yes. The Picts knew that adders do this after emerging from hibernation through a process known as ecdysis. And a symbolic headless snakeskin can actually be seen on the reverse of the cross slab at Hunter's Hill, Glamis, implying that the soul of the deceased has also come out of hibernation in the earth and been renewed. And can you see that this snake here, well, you can see the snake on the right has a head, but the one in the middle, it has no head because it's a snake skin, not an actual snake. The so-called notched rectangle Pictish symbol reflects how a reader of Adovnan's late 7th century De Locis Sanctis might have delineated the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, perhaps on a wax tablet, using the description of the domuncula, literally a small house, which he provided. The Emperor Constantine had masons cut away the rock face around Christ's cave tomb, making it stand alone like a tower. Adovnan says that the tool marks of the stonecutters can still be seen, and these often appear to be reproduced around the doorway to the tomb and on its sides. Some Pictish images appear to show passages to other small cave-like tombs of cavalry in the upper body of the domuncula. Of course, Christ's cave wasn't the only cave in Calvary. Calvary. It has a high and narrow doorway, which lies open, allowing the resurrected Christ, or in this case, the deceased, to leave. One example, now built upside down into the wall of Arndilly House in Aberdeenshire, has a dentiled cornice, similar to that seen on the early 6th century mosaic image of the tomb in the church of St. Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. So that's what I'm thinking that is, the edicule, as it's now called in the tomb, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This is there's a sequence of steps in this particular example. We're all familiar with the image of Daniel in the lion's den, as seen on the Meagle 2 cross slab here in the center. Here he is with 4 lions, 2 either side. Daniel was considered a type of Christ from early Christian times as a result of his escape from death and emergence from a cave, which is shown clearly on a 5th century sarcophagus from Meluden near Poitiers on the right there. And you can see the trees appearing on either side as Daniel rises up out of the cave, like Christ from the tomb, and leaving the lions behind. In many early Christian depictions of Daniel, the figure of Habakkuk is also present, mentioned in Deuterocanonical verses 21 to 42 in chapter 14 of the book of Daniel. In these verses, an angel airlifts Habakkuk by the hair from Judea, where he's taking stew and bread to the workers in the fields, seen here on the left, and instantaneously delivers him to Daniel's lion pit in Babylon, enabling him to feed Daniel and save him from starvation and death. You can see he's been in the middle one. There's a hand attached to his hair. Doesn't work for me, I'm afraid I have. And he's dropping him down to save Daniel with his stew and bread. Habakkuk's meal was therefore a symbol of heavenly deliverance, a sort of divine deliveroo, as well as a symbol of the Eucharist. On late Roman sarcophagi, he's seen next to Daniel with a bowl of food or bread having been dropped into the cave by the angel. You can see on the right, he's trying to get his attention there, poking him in the ribs with the bowl of bread. But this is interesting. Daniel and Habakkuk both appear and are named by inscriptions on a 6th century Burgundian copper alloy belt buckle plate from near Macon, where Habakkuk is shown in the same orant position as Daniel. So he's on the right. Daniel's got the lions on the left, and he's on the right, Habakkuk. And they're both named Abacou Propheta, it says on the bottom there. They're in the same orant position, which is a position of prayer. Their arms up. But Habakkuk has 2 containers of food attached to him. So he's got them attached to his waist, one on either side. You can see the baskets there, or containers of food. He's got his hands up in the air so he can't hold them. So they must be attached to him somehow. A similar orant figure with abundant hair and a similar cross on his chest can be seen on a pillar stone from over Kirkhope near Selkirk. And you can see where that is on the map. Again, it's south of the River Forth. And it's now on display in the Museum of Scotland. Originally located near a chapel site, the roughly carved figure has 2 dotted circular objects attached to him by a belt around his middle, one on each side of his waist. The flattened ends to his fingers betray a debt to a model such as the buckle, where the hands of the orant abut the top of the frame. You can see they're sort of squared off fingers. He looks like he's only got 4 of them as well. So the Overkirkhope stone appears to represent the hope of a late 6th or early 7th century British Christian for deliverance, as Habakkuk saved Daniel. And this is interesting because this is the period when Anglo-Saxons are penetrating from the east, from Bamborough, and attacking the Britons. So no doubt prayer would have been in order at that time. The linked dotted circles, known as the double disc symbol, could therefore represent an abbreviated symbol of God's deliverance of the faithful, representing the Eucharist or the Viaticum, given to the dying to sustain them. On the overcoat figure, the vessels appear to be attached around Habakkuk's waist by a belt. Several double discs have notches in them, which could logically represent vessel spouts, such as one at Enchira. That's in the lovely new Perth Museum, the Enchira stone. The London Links Cairn Cemetery in southeast Fife has been described by the excavators as that of a Christian community of the late 5th to 7th centuries. Here, a cairn takes the shape of a double disc in monumental form. And this could be, if it's linked to the double disc symbolism, it could be interpreted as an appeal for God's sustenance, protection, and deliverance of those lying at rest in the 3 stone long kist burials it encloses. So when we examine the use of the zeta, the Z, often reversed, overlying the snake, notched rectangle, and double disc, you can see them all here, we can hypothesize that they add the word life or live to these symbols. The zeta overlies these symbols in the same way that the wreath overlies the cross, turning a symbol of death into one of new life. All the symbols with Z rods relate to the sustaining of life within an enclosed cave and miraculous emergence through a narrow opening to new life, and are metaphors for the resurrection of the individual from the grave. So the snake escapes through a hole in the rock, Christ from the cave tomb, and Daniel from his den. They are given new life. Images of great sea eagles, known to have been up to have up to 2.5 meter wingspans, can be seen perching above the buildings I've interpreted as tombs on symbol stones, for example at Tyre. Incised eagles at rest have a marked northern distribution, with the finest example found on the symbol stone from Know of Burien on Orkney. This may reflect an extremely ancient and long-lived veneration of this majestic bird on Orkney, evidenced in eagle bones and talons recovered from the Tomb of the Eagles, and an eagle bone foundation deposit under Building 6 at the Ness of Brodgar. Like British warriors mentioned in the Gododin, in no doubt powerful Picts compared themselves to eagles and aspired to their qualities. An existing native reverence for the sea eagle, perhaps as a divine carrier of souls, could have been integrated with Roman imperial use of the eagle as a symbol of victory and the apotheosis of emperors, and the Physiologus's allegorical vision of the eagle as approaching the sun, representing Christ, and then bathing in the fountain of life to renew its plumage and eyesight. This reflects King David's psalm, his saying in Psalm 103, "Your youth will be renewed like the eagles." You can see on the right how the soul of an emperor is flying up to the sky in the form of an eagle there on the right. But it occurs in Physiologus in a Christian context. On the symbol stones, the eagle may be interpreted as perching above the open tomb of a Pict, representing a soul at rest, waiting for the moment to ascend to heaven to renew itself and bathe in the fountain of life. The fish is of course, one of the most common early Christian symbols. It can signify either Christ or the Christian swimming in the waters of baptism. The vertical fish appears on Christian epitaphs in Rome, but also in the borders on a large pillar found reused as a nilometer in the River Teviot, now at Borthwick, seen here in the centre. This hasn't previously been included in the main corpus of Pictish stones, but I think it's important. From there, it can be traced to the north on the walls of caves at East Weems in Fife and Cossey on the coast of Murray. It also appears at the base of one side of St Andrew's 19 on the right, and on a late Scandinavian cross slab Andreas 128 on the Isle of Man, where it accompanies significantly an image of the risen Christ, holding a cross there and a book. The Christian interpretation of the vertical or rising fish sees in it the hope that a Christian will rise at the resurrection as a fish rises to the surface or jumps from the water, like a salmon leaping. And Zeno of Verona said that the fish coming up from the dark deep is a metaphor for Christ arising from the dead. Similar rising fish can be seen in lines decorating the fronts of 6th century ambos or pulpits in Ravenna, together with other symbolic creatures. And about half of the fish symbols you find in Pictish art are either vertical or they're rising. Half are just swimming along. But I think they represent Christians. On the 6th century mosaic floor of the baptistry at Butrent in Albania, an arch frames a cross, itself above a fountain where 2 stags drink. The arch proclaims the victory of the souls of those finding salvation and entering the gate of heaven. The Pictish arch symbol may occasionally combine with a V-rod, as at Migvi, showing that the entrance to heaven offers eternal life, while a horseman on a cross slab at Editon arrives in heaven through an archway that also doubles as his burial mound. That's on the right, lower right there. In Adovnan's Life of Columba, the soul of a pious layman after death is described as being rescued from demons in the air and brought ad aeternae refrigerationis locum, the place of eternal rest, by angels. The gourd plant, which grew to shade Jonah as he rested outside Nineveh after his ordeal with the sea monster, was popular on 4th century sarcophagi in Rome, as it evoked a place of eternal rest, a reward for his ordeal. You can see Jonah reclining under the gourd there on the left. The symbol is known from 4th century Roman Britain through a bronze sheet from a casket shrine at Ely in Gloucestershire. The gourd was an alien plant and was simplified by the Picts to act as a symbolic shelter to resting souls in the grave. A flower or gourd symbol at Glamis, top right, is at the base of the Hunter's Hill cross slab, as if sheltering the deceased while asleep beneath the stone, perhaps, while one at Gask shelters a horseman, perhaps representing a man buried below. On a symbol stone with a gourd on the island of Pabe, a cross was added as if it supplemented its meaning. But it does look as if the cross is planted in a burial mound as well. The cross seems to be later, but it fits well with the symbolism. The crescent and V-rod, Pictish beast and double disc and Z-rod are often destinations for aristocratic horsemen riding across Pictish cross slabs, representing death, rest, resurrection, and eternal life, all linked but subtly different symbols of Christian salvation. You can see that the riders are aiming towards the symbols as if they're holy destinations. One of them seems to be riding on top of a Pictish beast. George and Isabel Henderson suggested that the books held by angels adjacent to the cross on the Abelemno roadside slab might represent books of life containing the names of those for whom prayers would be said in church. You can see the angels leaning forward, bowing to the cross with their books at top right there. Thomas Clancy noted that names of several Pictish kings were included in the Book of Life at Lindisfarne. In an apse mosaic of about 625 in Rome, St. Agnes holds a Book of Life in the form of a scroll. One Pictish symbol found on 2 symbol stones at Kintradwell in Sutherland resembles leaves of parchment drawn under the chair of St. Matthew in a manuscript fragment of Irish origin, preserved in the library at St. Gallen in Switzerland. You can see that on the left. Given that Kintradwell is only a 1.4 mile boat trip over the Dornoch Firth from the monastery of Portmahomack, where Martin Carver excavated a unique parchment making workshop for the production of manuscripts, a link seems possible. This symbol may represent a list of names of the secular elite who made gifts to the monastery and whose souls the monks of Portmahomack prayed for in church. The stones express the hope that the names of the anonymous elite Picts once buried beneath them were entered in the Book of Life. Exclusion was a terrible fate, as Columba himself deleted Feradach from the Book of Life for killing Terrain, a Pictish fugitive, while in his retinue, condemning Feradach to be carried off to infernal regions. And this is one of my favourite stones. One of the great cross slabs of Easter Ross at Shandwick, located in an ancient graveyard. It appears to reflect reception of several late 7th century pseudo-scientific texts known from Ireland. The Liber de Ordine Creaturarum describes the successive layers of the cosmos according to weight, from the light air at the top down through the heavier layers of water, earth, and hell. The Irish Augustine, the writer of the De Mirabilibus Sacrae Scripturae in the year 655, also included the abyss beneath the earth, from where subterranean waters were allowed to escape upwards and combine with a downpour from the air to cause the Great Flood. All these layers appear to be represented on the reverse of the 8th century Shandwick cross slab, with the double disc representing the air, the realm of angels and heavenly sustenance, and the Cetus or sea monster, the salvific water, which can at any time cover the earth, of course, representing baptism, death, and new life. Together with the swirling waters and springs of the abyss and the prison-like compartments of hell filled with serpentine creatures at the base, these layers are all given a role in salvation, or otherwise, of the people populating the earth, with God's other creatures in the central panel. You can see them walking and riding along there. They have a choice of whether to go up to heaven or down to hell. The person commemorated may be viewed as inside the Cetus, like Jonah, supplied with heavenly food from above, awaiting the resurrection. To return to the groups of symbols with similar semantic meanings, it becomes clear that no symbols are abstract. They all have a meaning. And there are many ways to say the same thing. The combinations of symbols all create slightly varying statements of hope concerning the rest in the grave, spiritual sustenance, and resurrection of the deceased. Some symbols represent more than one aspect of salvation, such as Jonah's Cetus, which symbolizes baptism, death, rest in the grave, and resurrection in one image. When found on portable artifacts, the symbols offer the same hope of God's protection, deliverance, and eternal life for the living. But the ladle and comb of baptism are not found on these artifacts or in caves, which suggests that they were specific to burial monuments. These identifications of symbolic invocations to God paint a positive picture of how the Picts envisaged a Christian death, placing faith in the sacraments and saintly intercession to secure a period of rest for the dead, as if out at sea like Noah and Jonah, a shedding of earthly skin like an adder, a salmon-like leaping towards salvation, and an eagle-like flight to the gate of heaven for the soul, to be washed in the fountain of life, or to drink its water like a stag. And if I've got time, I'll just show you a few interpretations of some of these stones that you can perhaps consider, where you can see on the left an eagle about to fly up from the tomb. In the middle, snake and a fish rising. On the right, the gourd over the grave with the life in the grave symbol of the double disc and Z rod, and the mirror and comb underneath. These are things that perhaps from the symbols you could actually infer if they are prayers relating to these particular symbols. And of course, incised in stone, they're there permanently. So in a way, they're a little bit like, Tibetan, wheels that these prayers are always being said. They're carved there, they're there eternally. And whenever you might pass a stone, you might recite the prayer that's inscribed there. But they're symbols that prompt perhaps a prayer for the dead. And then the one I particularly like here is on the left, the Maiden Stone in Aberdeenshire, where you've got the mirror and comb at, or the what I say, the ladle and comb at the base, you know, close to the head of the buried. So a baptized Christian, and then the sea monster rests here as Jonah rested in the belly of the Ketis for 3 days. May God give them life and rise out of the tomb at the resurrection. And then at the top, you've got a centaur, and the centaur is sort of pointing the way to paradise. And it's exactly like the centaur who met Saint Anthony in the desert and pointed him to Paul's tomb. So he's actually got his hand out and he's pointing you to paradise. And you can see the centaurs at the top, who are particularly warlike creatures, are actually hugging each other. So it's a kind of an evocation of peace in paradise. And I think that little creature next to the centaur's back is actually the wolf that leads Anthony to Paul's cave because he's looking for water. And then this one here, this is a famous stone at Palemno, and it's got a war scene, a battle scene, and it's a scene which is believed to represent the battle where King Egfrith defeats the Pictish king Brede defeats the Northumbrian king Egfrith, the Battle of Nectanasmere, which is not too far from Aberlemno. But it seems to me that it is a memorial to King Brede because this could be his tomb, and it could be, you know, I suppose stating that he, you know, will be resurrected. But these are his earthly accomplishments. And it's a revival of a Roman victory narrative sculpture seen on triumphal columns in Rome. And Brede died in 692. So if this is a memorial to Brede, who we think was actually buried on Iona, it could date to about 692. But so there we are. These are some logical conclusions, if you might accept some of my suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed. I think that has given us amount to think about. I certainly will never look at a Pictish stone in the same light again. You know, I've always thought they're extraordinarily enigmatic symbols, but you really have shown us that maybe they're not just quite so enigmatic, and that they do have absolute meaning, and they're not, as you say, just completely random symbols. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So I'll take a few questions.
Certainly, yes.
If anybody would like to. Yes, Leo.
Yeah, the Book of Kells, I think some people maintain there's a lot of Pictish sort of symbolism in that. Or is there a cultural assimilation or something? I mean,
there's a new book out by Victoria Whitworth, which really looks at the connections between Book of Kells and Pictish art. It's very well worth getting. And the Book of Kells is, you know, has always been well assumed by many to be product of Iona, but the amount of the number of connections with Pictish art and Pictish motifs and imagery suggested it's quite possible that it was created in Pictland. And I think you have to read the book to kind of come to your own conclusion.
it's great.
Yeah. But yeah, there are all kinds of similarities. Isabel Henderson also looked at the connections between Pictish art and the Book of Kells. But what we're talking about here is sort of insular art, which is well, you have to think about the Anglo-Saxon, Irish, and Pictish and Pictish monks all, I suppose, moving around a lot from the 7th century and, you know, exchanging ideas and working together on manuscripts. and it's very difficult to see a sort of a national identity appearing, in some of these manuscripts. But yeah, I think there's more work to do on it, I think.
Thank you very much. Fascinating and interesting chat. Just sort of related thing. The scrutiny who is connected, you know, when do you, in your opinion, when do you think they arrived in Ireland? Just as your opinion.
I think that the thing about that is that there's constant migration and crossing of that seaway, for centuries and centuries. And it's very difficult to see a sort of an arrival. It's more of a connection. And it's probably unlikely to be sort of ethnic. But I think there are very good works on this by, I think, Cormac McSparran and also Russell O'Regan. They've written a lot about Dalriada and connections across to Northern Ireland as well. So I'm not an expert on it, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I have to go for a train.
Oh, yeah, very important.
George?
On the cross slab at Glamis, there's interlacing on the face of the cross, and there's a circle disc at the center of the cross, and inside the disc there's another cross which is twisted about 10 degrees of the major cross. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, sometimes, some scholars have claimed this is carelessness. It's impossible to be careless when you're laying out a design of that sophistication. So it must have been deliberate, I think. And if you go to Kells, and there's, at Monaster Boyce, there's some very famous crosses at Monaster Boyce. But if you go to look at the undecorated cross, which is, I forget, I suppose it's to the north really, or the northeast of the main church, you'll see that there's a cross which has a simple circle on one side, which is also at that angle. So it must be significant. And of course, in later, medieval art, it's associated sometimes with, Christ who's looking down to his right and looking at perhaps the good thief, or maybe favoring, the good thief on his right. And people have thought that this is too early for that kind of iconographic significance for this tilt, but there is something certainly going on there. On some high crosses, or particularly a low cross at Duleek, Christ is looking to one side. So, sometimes he can be shown to be, tilting his head in one direction. So it may be linked to that sort of symbolism, but it is something that occurs elsewhere. So it's worth looking out for. If you know of any others, I'd be interested.
Just, obviously, you give us a lot of interpretation of various things. Is there any oral tradition of some of what these symbols meant, which was later captured in writing, or has a lot of it just been lost?
Well, I think the whole problem is that, the understanding of the tradition has been lost because people have had to study these things, I guess, from 18th century onwards and sort of start from scratch. And there have been some weird and wonderful ideas about what they are. And but it is interesting that they seem to disappear around about the end of the 9th century, I think. And it may be something that, well, this is about the time when the kingdom of, the Scottish kingdom is created from, I suppose, both the Pictish and the kingdom of Dalriada under Kenneth MacAlpine and his followers, that sort of era. So it may be that it just wasn't a tradition that was followed by the new elite of that period. But crosses on their own do appear, and they're called class 3 stones. The symbols seem to disappear. So it is a bit of a mystery, and there doesn't seem to be any, written or oral testimony about them. But I mean, it's marvelous that they've survived in such large numbers, really. There are hundreds of them. It's difficult to know what else they might be, really.
Are there any similar symbols on stones in Scandinavia?
Yes, there are. There have been threads of research, trying to connect these to the rune stones and other stones in Scandinavia. And again, they're probably stones that, erected by the elite, and they often have names on them in runes and so on. I think, and there has been a move to see these as cognate with those stones in Scandinavia. But the symbols themselves don't appear there. So they seem to be unique to Scotland. So it's worthwhile, I think, looking at all these different countries and seeing their traditions and comparing them. They're all slightly different, which is interesting. Every area seems to have expressed its religious ideas and Christianity in a slightly different way. So it's where Christian teaching meets local, I suppose, traditions, which is very interesting. So I think that if these symbols are Christian, they do shed light on, what came before, that these people were, interested in these particular ways of expressing themselves, particularly thinking about the animals and how they see themselves as leaping salmon and flying eagles. It sort of maybe could shed some light on, what came before Christianity.
Mike, would the artisans, the masons who sculpted the images and the stones, you reckon they would have been versed in the theology themselves, or would they have been directed by some sort of priest class?
Well, they could have been directed, but we know that, a lot of monks were skilled in all kinds of crafts as well. So we know there were metalsmiths, they wrote manuscripts, and they could well have been stone carvers as well. So I like to think that they did have, if they didn't have it, they were instructed in the theology behind what they were doing. But it makes you wonder, were these people itinerant, or how were they taught, and where were they based? All kinds of questions, very interesting. But I think that the incised stones require less skill. So is it possible that there were itinerant craftsmen who were actually working for the elite and providing what they wanted, or a different, maybe they had a book of models that they could choose from and have any combination. It's just interesting that they're all so different. I mean, there are some that recur in patterns, like the eagle above the tomb, but there are so many different combinations. So they were being quite individualistic, and perhaps they could ask the mason to provide, the ones that they particularly wanted.
I was thinking on the map that you showed at the beginning, there's some very heavy clusters of Pictish stones in sort of very significant difference between these, or was it broadly the same? Right.
Well, there are different emphases, I suppose, in or clusters of particular types of symbols, but they do seem to occur right across the board. But the eagle, for instance, is a particularly northern one. The rectangle is mainly northern. So it's quite possible that they, were popular in places where they had significance. Perhaps they struck a chord with people in that area. But they might have been created by a committee, and at a particular point. It might have been I suppose, a work of cooperation between Lumban clergy and Pictish clergy, who were being trained and created the Pictish church. So it might have been something that they agreed between them, and that this was a way to, I suppose, incorporate the elite in the Christian church, so that there was hope for resurrection and a new life. This was the attraction for joining the church, so it could have been a policy.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Any last questions, anybody? Yes, Doc.
How do you know that that's the Pictish Victor King Brady?
Well, no, we don't. But the fellow with the helmet seems to be wearing an Anglo-Saxon type helmet. It's like the Coppergate helmet, found in York. He's running away. He lost a battle. He was killed, in fact. And the fellow chasing him, I think it's going to be quite important. Might not be a king. It might be a local, an important member of the elite in Angus, But, it's the sort of thing that's worthy of a king, you might say. But, it might not be him. But the battle is in 685. And so, whoever it is, it's probably a local lord of some kind. And whenever he died, this might have been put up to him. But we don't know how long he lived in that case after the battle. But he probably survived the battle. But he's quite near the tomb above his head, I think. So I like to think that he's the fellow who ended up in the symbolic tomb. But I don't necessarily, I suppose if it is a burial stone, a grave stone, and not just a memorial, then if it's a Pictish lord, Dr. Bidet, he could be could have been underneath it originally. Could have been set up where his tomb was,
On the back of that?
Yes, there's a cross. Yeah. So I didn't show you the lovely crosses on the backs of lots of these. But I'd need a course to do that. I won't give a course that one.
Any questions online?
David asked, does the Tullabore Cross, County Antrim, have a Pictish connection?
County Antrim. Oh, I think this is one with a with two croziers on it, isn't it? I think it's got two croziers, and I think one interpretation is that they could be the croziers of Anthony and Paul. And they seem to be intertwined, I think. But they're incised. And there is a crozier which is thought to be a symbol on a stone at St. Vigin's. So a crozier could be a protective symbol, like these symbols themselves. So there probably is some kind of religious connection if they're croziers.
They've been working this on the moon. Has been fun.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, that everybody done? Well, just to say a very big thank you again from Mike for coming.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciation for
Thank
you. So thank you so much for such an interesting talk. As I say, it really has been quite enlightening, and I certainly will in Scotland Pictish stones I come.
Feel more interest.
Okay.
You must go and visit them. You must go and visit them.